Thank you. I'm very glad to be here at the Mises Institute, and Lou Rockwell has sponsored my work for many decades, and I'm grateful to him. And I'd also like to thank Brian Lee Biggs for sponsoring my talk. As you'll find out, it was a mistake, but we're glad to have him. Anyway, I should say I don't have a very loud voice, so if you can't hear me, just put up your hand. Of course, anyone who puts his hand up is lying. What I'd like to talk to you today is about Charles Beard, who was the most famous American historian in the period around 1900 to around 1945 or so. He was regarded as the outstanding American historian. But although this was true, that he was considered the most outstanding American historian, because his non-interventionist views on American foreign policy were the subject of a propaganda campaign by supporters of American intervention into World War II, he was, in effect, blacked out of the historical profession. And by the time of his death in 1948, he lived from around 1873 to 1948. By the time of his death, he was practically no longer cited, although, as I say, he'd been one of the most, the top American historian. He was regarded as the greatest historian, and his most famous work, which probably many of you read, came out in 1913, and it was called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And what he tried to do in that book, and it was a book that Murray Rothbard thought very well of, was that he tried to show, although Rothbard differed with him on some of the way Beard had conducted his analysis, was that he tried to show the various economic interests who were behind the Constitution, that there was, he was trying to show the class interests, economic group interests, who had supported various proposals for a constitution. And this was something that was a kind of a constant throughout his career. He would try to show what were the economic interests behind proposals. And he thought that people generally acted in accord with their economic interests. But it didn't mean, in his way of viewing things, that they were solely motivated by their economic interests and that the ideas didn't matter. He thought ideas mattered also, but that both needed to be taken account of. So he said, this view of looking at a historical analysis where you consider both the interests and the ideas that people have, is something that he learned not from Marx, but from the James Madison in the 10th federalist, where Madison had spoken of conflicting economic interests that all had to be brought together into one nation and that the various interests would balance each other. And this was basic to Beard's approach. Now, what I want to suggest in this talk is that Beard used this idea of analyzing historical events in terms of both the economic interests and ideas and ideology in formulating a foreign policy for the United States. And in particular, he defended a view of American foreign policy, which critics call isolationism, but which he called continentalism, which I think is a very good plan for American foreign policy even today. It's one that's very consistent with the libertarian view of non-interventionism, one that was stressed very much by Murray Rothbard, that American foreign policy should be based on complete non-intervention in the affairs of other countries. So what Beard did was that he had distinguished three different models that could guide American foreign policy. The one which he favored was this continentalism, or critics called it isolationism. The ones he opposed were imperialism and internationalism. And he felt that it was very important in his analysis of World War I and especially World War II. He thought that the other two models of imperialism and internationalism had combined to overthrow the policy of continentalism, which he favored. I should say there's an additional connection between Beard and Murray Rothbard in that in this case, I should say a connection between Beard and Ludwig von Mises is that it turns out that one person who greatly admired both Beard and Charles Beard and Mises was Eugene Davidson, who had gotten Mises' Human Action published, and Mises thanks Eugene Davidson in his acknowledgments to human action. And he was also responsible for the publication of Beard's last two books, which were two-volume series. The first volume was called American Foreign Policy in the Making, 1932 to 1940, a study in appearance and reality. And the second volume, which came out in 1948, the year that Beard died, was called President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War in 1941, a study in appearance and reality, the same subtitle. So it was Davidson who had gotten both books published. Incidentally, if you want a book on read a book on the Nuremberg trials, Davidson has a very good book on that, analyzing all the main issues in those trials. All right, now I want to cover in some detail what Beard meant by continentalism. This was the view that which Beard held had been the dominant view since the time the America started to exist as a separate nation in 1789 for down to the end of the 19th century. And this was one that the U.S. should avoid involvement in the foreign conflicts of Europe and Asia. And what he says here about this is from his book of Foreign Policy for America, which came out in 1940. He says, the primary foreign policy for the United States may be called for convenience continental Americanism. The two words imply a concentration of interest on the continental domain and on building here a civilization in many respects peculiar to American life and the potentials of the American heritage. In concrete terms, the words mean non-intervention in the controversies and war of Europe and Asia and resistance to the intrusion of European or Asiatic power systems and imperial ambitions into the Western Hemisphere. The policy is positive, it is clear-cut, and it was maintained with consistency while the Republic was being founded, democracy extended, and an American civilization developed. And he mentions in this connection, he says, when this was an early theme even before the Constitution came into effect, that in the American Revolution, one of the reasons the colonies revolted from England is that because they were under English sovereignty, they would be involved in European wars. And he says, Thomas Paine gave as one of the grounds for breaking with Great Britain the desire to escape becoming embroiled in all her European conflicts. Now, there were, as I say, this policy was pretty consistently pursued, Beard suggests, during about till the time of the Spanish-American War. The biggest exception to it, which nearly precipitated conflict, came about after the revolutions of 1848, when the Hungarian revolutionary Louis Kossuth came to the U.S. and gave a series of talks favoring defending Hungarian independence, and he was very popular in the U.S. and people were very sympathetic to intervening in Hungary, and there was some talk of giving him aid. And in fact, America sent an agent to go to Austria to have a look at what was going on there, just have a look and see what was going on in Hungary. And when the Austrian government heard about that, they were very, very angry and they demanded an apology, but this wasn't forthcoming. And there was, for a while, it looked like there was going to be a crisis and possibly some intervention, but then America decided, no, this wasn't a good idea. Daniel Webster, who had favored intervention, changed his mind about it. So war was averted. I should say, you might not be surprised, one of the people who was very sympathetic to intervening was someone who was in Congress in 1848, was Abraham Lincoln. So he was an interventionist even back then. So at any way, though, as I say, this was the U.S. policy, was, Beard says, of staying out of the wars of other countries. And he said this was the policy both of the Federalists, and he quoted Washington's farewell address, and then it was also the policy of Thomas Jefferson, who is one who spoke about entangling alliances. And the idea was that America should not get involved in what wasn't our concern. One reason Beard supported this did not have to do with an aversion to war in general. He was perfectly happy with wars within the American continent designed for expansion of the American frontier. And he was not a strong supporter of Indian rights. He thought it was perfectly all right for America to go in and get rid of the Indians in order to expand. But what he objected to was intervention abroad, which he thought was something that we would be unable to, we didn't have would get us involved in all sorts of conflicts unnecessarily, and that we could really do nothing about. We wouldn't be able to change their, if we thought, say, that we wanted to spread the American ideas of freedom abroad, we wouldn't be able to do it. We don't have the power to change the customs and political institutions of other countries. So that's the first system, the one which he favored. Now, around this changed in the, as I say, around the end of the 19th century. And there'd been some changes, moves in this direction before that. And particularly, there'd been American naval officers who had wanted to expand American interests in Asia. And they were ones who wanted to get territory there. But for the most part, these had been kept under control. They hadn't really achieved all that much until the Spanish-American War in 1898. Now, Beard was one who and this is again a similarity with Rothbard, and I think Rothbard was influenced by Beard in this connection. He wasn't just satisfied with making general statements about which interest groups favored which policies. He wanted to name names. He was one of the, history for him very much involved picking out villains. And for this policy of imperialism, he blamed, I think in particular, tended to blame 5 people. One of them was probably his pet aversion, was the American writer on naval affairs who taught at the Annapolis for many years, Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose most famous book was The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And what Mahan stressed in that book was that by controlling the sea lanes, the power that controlled sea lanes could use sea power as a means of expansion, which he favored both for economic and ideological reasons. So Mahan wanted to expand at all costs. And what I'll just quote what he says there is what he said about Mahan. Someone had to make attractive and sell the idea of sea power and empire to the American landlubbers. The mission was undertaken by a naval officer, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who may with justice be called the most successful propagandist ever produced in the United States. And the other person he really didn't like was Theodore Roosevelt, whom he regarded as someone who was just favored military action for its own sake, that he was bored by civilian life, and he wanted war, which he thought would really stir things up. So Beard himself had been a supporter of the American efforts in World War I, but he felt after the war, when the secret treaties had come out, he felt he'd been disillusioned, and then he was particularly upset by the policy that Woodrow Wilson had favored, and this policy was this third model, which was one of internationalism. In this policy, the notion, he says here, the third foreign policy proposed for the United States is the internationalism, which sets world peace as the fundamental objective for the government in the conduct of relations with other countries. And he thought there that what was wrong with this is that it had the idea that the U.S. could secure peace not only for the American continent, but for the whole world, and that this was a completely unrealistic policy for the U.S. to pursue. And he thought that Franklin Roosevelt had when Roosevelt first came into office, Beard had hoped that he would be a supporter of continentalism, but he felt that Roosevelt had changed his mind sometime around 1937 when he gave his famous speech, October 1937, the famous Chicago Bridge speech where he called for a quarantine of the against the aggressors, by which he meant Germany and Japan. And Beard was very much opposed to this. And he pointed out the very bad results of World War I. He says, as a consequence of the war called necessary to overthrow Hitler's despotism, another despotism was raised to a higher pitch of power. How can it be argued conclusively with reference to inescapable facts that the end justified the means to involve the United States in that war? And in his last book, this one, President Roosevelt and the Coming of the War, he warned that if the executive was allowed unlimited power to conduct foreign relations with other countries, this would lead to despotism, because how could you have an executive in charge of American foreign policy, complete charge, could do whatever you want, and try to have a limited government? He thought this would be absolutely impossible. And I think we can see in the years since he wrote that he was entirely right. Thank you